All right, so we're going to be talking today and about not the congressional differences, not the constitutional differences. We have been doing that. You took the quiz over that information. But about those procedural differences between the House and the Senate. You might remember when you were doing your Article 1 questions that one of the questions asked, like, what are the kinds of things the House and Senate can decide for themselves? Like that aren't in the Constitution. And the answer, I think the Constitution says like other procedures and operations or something. But basically it means the day-to-day functioning of the House and Senate are decided by the bodies themselves. And although they can change at basically any time, if there was a majority vote taken on those rules, they're really unlikely to change. They have a lot of permanence in terms of like the history and tradition. And so we can sort of draw conclusions about the function of Congress based on the way that their procedures work. So this is just a look at those constitutional differences. Remember that at any time you can go online to Schoology. These PowerPoints are there, and you can print out any of the slides that you're interested in. But this is sort of a recap of that. And so this is the slide we're going to be focusing on for most of today. I just want to reiterate, please don't just start copying down these words. We're going to go through each of them. If you want those words, you can print them. But this is just sort of the best, like I like to have it all up at the same time so you can kind of compare. But don't write things we're not talking about yet because it gets confusing. So to start off with, one of the most important things you want to keep in mind about the House and the Senate is that they have a very different character, right? So members of the House tend to be younger. Obviously, they constitutionally are allowed to be younger, but just in general, they tend to be younger. They tend to have less political experience. So we're more likely to see somebody elected to the House of Representatives who has never been in politics before in their life. It's still, I would say, a minority of people in the House, but it's much more likely there than in the Senate. Members of the House have more turnover, so we are more likely to see freshmen, so-called members of Congress in the U.S. House of Representatives. And then there are just a whole bunch more of them, right? There are 435 members of the House as compared to only 100 senators. So because of all of those reasons, the House is going to operate in a much more formal way. So rules matter a whole lot more in the House. Seniority matters. House leadership has a whole bunch more power than does Senate leadership. Political parties tend to be stronger in the House. We very rarely see members of either party crossing lines, like voting with the other party, whereas in the Senate that is more likely. So just as a general sort of character message, the House is much sort of more rigid than the Senate, but for obvious reasons. If you have to get 435 newbies to get things accomplished, you need to kind of have some structure and have pretty strong leaders. So there's that. One of the elements of leadership in the House that is really, really strong is the Speaker of the House, the position of House Speaker. Now, the Speaker of the House is elected by the members of the House, which obviously means they're elected by the majority party in the House, right? Because that's how it works. So right now, the Speaker of the House is Republican Paul Ryan, and the Speaker of the House is probably the second most powerful office in U.S. government. The first most powerful being the U.S. President. The second most powerful is definitely the Speaker of the House. The Vice President has almost no power at all, so don't worry about them. But the Speaker of the House has huge amounts of power. I'll give you a couple of examples. First, the Speaker of the House has the power to assign every bill to committee. So let's say that I am from West Texas. I spent a lot of time this weekend with my brother-in-law who's from West Texas, and I want to introduce a bill that will allow more people to open their land to fracking. Right? So we want to allow more fracking. If I want that bill to pass, do I want it to be assigned to the Energy Committee or the Environment Committee? Energy, right? If I want a bill that says let's have more fracking, I want it to go to the the Energy Committee. That doesn't mean the Environment Committee couldn't pass it, just that they would be more likely to find fault with it than a committee whose focus is on increasing American energy independence or whatever. Okay, so the Speaker of the House gets to choose where every bill goes. So the Speaker likes me. He might send my bill to the Energy Committee. If I have made the Speaker angry, my bill might end up in the Environment Committee, and there's not a darn thing I can do about it. So that's a lot of power for the Speaker to have over legislation in the first place. Another thing the Speaker does is that the Speaker of the House is in charge of making all committee appointments. That means the physical committee on which you sit is also determined by the Speaker. And as most of you know, through your reading for the mini quiz, lots of the the committee that you're on gives you a whole bunch of benefits. So again, let's say I'm a West Texas congressperson. Do I want to end up on a committee about port regulations? Why not? There's no ports in West Texas. How can I possibly do any credit claiming if I'm on some committee about ports? What do my constituents care about? They don't. They don't care about ports at all. So, but if I make the speaker mad, I might find myself banished to the port committee. And again, there is nothing I can do about it. I'll just be stuck there for the rest of the congressional term. So that's kind of rough. This is one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of turnover for the Speaker of the House. So it's almost been, I guess, a year and a half now that John Boehner was kind of pushed out as Speaker. And if you were paying attention, you would have noticed that it was big news. They talked about it all the time. Like, oh my gosh, this is, there's been a rebellion, a coup within the Republican Party in the House or whatever. And the reason that this sort of spoken in such strong language is that it's very rare. Because unless you're 100% certain that you're going to like win, that you'll be able to unseat the current Speaker of the House, you definitely don't want to vote against him. Because if you fail, like if you say, I'm voting for somebody else, and they're all public roll call votes, and then the speaker wins anyway, then you're going to find yourself banished to that port committee, right? So the Speaker of the House has a lot of power. There's no replica of that in the Senate. The Senate is led by, officially, okay, well there is a majority leader in the Senate, but officially the leader of the Senate is the Vice President, right? Which, just to confuse you, is known as the President of the Senate, who is the Vice President of the United States. But the Vice President can only break ties. And so usually doesn't show up. And most of the time, the person who like sits at the front desk, and bangs the gavel is called the President pro tempore or the President pro tem. But neither of those roles have any power, right? The President pro tem literally just sits there and like bangs the gavel when it's time to start the session, and is the one to say like, I recognize Senator so and so, but doesn't have any power to like say no. If you raise your hand in the Senate and you get to speak when it's your turn, there's nobody who can like stop you from speaking unless the cloture is called. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, so the Speaker of the House has a lot of power. Another big source of power in the House of Representatives, which also sort of goes back to the Speaker, because remember the Speaker is in charge of committee assignments, is this thing called the House Rules Committee. The House Rules Committee. Now, there is no such thing as a Rules Committee in the Senate. It doesn't exist. So this is another thing that's unique to the House. And I'll show you over here. We're going to get into more detail about this on Wednesday. But basically speaking, when a bill becomes a law, it sort of starts off, it's proposed in one house, and then it's going to get referred to committee, and the committee has hearings about it. And then if the committee likes it, they're going to recommend it for floor debate, and then it's debated on the floor. And then if it passes on the floor, it goes to the other house, right? Like, you get that process, I think. Nod your heads, 8th grade. Great, schoolhouse rock, awesome. Okay, so the thing is that in the House of Representatives, there's an extra step. Because let's say my fracking bill was recommended for floor debate by the Energy Committee. Well, they might recommend it for floor debate, but before it gets to the floor, it has to first go through the House Rules Committee. Every single bill that will be debated on the floor of the House has to stop in the House Rules Committee. Every single one. Remember, the Speaker of the House is in charge of appointing who's in charge of the House Rules Committee. And this is a really important committee. Because the House Rules Committee is going to make a lot of decisions. First, they're going to set rules for debate, including a time limit for the debate. So, when we get to the Senate, we'll talk about what a filibuster is. But for now, I'll tell you there's no such thing as a filibuster in the House. Because every single bill has a time limit for debate. This bill can be debated for no more than 7 hours. And when that time is up, whatever the time limit is, the bill must immediately call for a vote. They must. There's no other way around it. You can't keep talking. It will come up for a vote. Another thing that the House Rules Committee decides on is whether or not we're going to be debating this bill under open rule or closed rule. An open rule bill is usually reserved for really controversial ones. It doesn't happen very often. But an open rule bill is going to allow amendments to be made. Okay? So an open rule bill is going to allow amendments to be made. And I'm sure that you are all intelligent enough to tell me what a closed rule bill must mean then. No amendments. That's right. There's no amendments that are allowed. Usually, bills are going to be set to closed rule debate because it's faster, right? So it's going to enable things to go more efficiently. Now, whether a bill is under open or closed rule, so even if a bill is under open rule, in the House there is a prohibition on so-called non-germane amendments. The words are up there in bold and italics if you're looking for how to spell that word. So in the House, non-germane amendments are prohibited. So even if it's an open rule bill, non-germane amendments are prohibited. What does that mean? Well, Let's say that Josh were to ask me about, hey, Mrs. R, did you hear about that bill that was going to ban dog walking or something? And I would say, wow, Josh, this is a great question, but it's not germane to the discussion, so let's table that for later. What did I mean when I said it's not germane to the discussion? It's irrelevant, right? It has nothing to do with what we're talking about right now, so it's probably not best to do it now. Well, what that means that non-germane amendments are forbidden is that even under open rule, we can only add amendments that are actually related to the bill itself. So let's say it's a bill on fracking. A germane amendment, one that's allowed under open rule, would be like a licensing requirement. They have to get a license if they want to do fracking, or like a special tax that's going to correspond with companies that do fracking. Those are germane amendments, and they would be allowed under what kind of rule? Open rule, right. But a non-germane amendment would be like, oh, this is a bill about fracking. Let's add an amendment that defunds Planned Parenthood. They did that a lot in the last session. Is that allowed? It is not. It is not. Nobody in the House can propose a non-germane amendment. All the amendments have to be related to the topic of the bill. Now, in the Senate, there is no such rule. So in the Senate, they add non-germane amendments. They're called riders. They add those all the time. And if they pass in the Senate, and then they go to the House, can the House vote on them? Yes, because it's not an amendment anymore, it's just a bill, right? This is the bill they were given, and now they're just voting on the bill. So we get riders all the time, like in laws that are passed, always extra amendments that have nothing to do with anything. But they can't originate in the House. They have to originate in the Senate, these non-germane amendments. Any questions about how the House works? Lots of structure, lots of power for the Speaker, and the House Rules Committee is kind of in charge of everything. Yes?
Can you do that writing thing? So say like the bill is like approved in the House of Representatives and then goes to the Senate, can they add amendments? Can the Senate add amendments, or is that only done when the bill is proposed?
No, the Senate can add amendments, but then, we'll get into more of this later, but then if the Senate passes it with amendments that the House didn't have, then it will have to go back to the House to be voted on again, because for a bill to become law, identical versions have to be passed in both houses. But yes, it could go that way. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about the Senate now. So again, the Senate is much less centralized. There's much less like authority or power vested in the leadership. For example, if you're assigned to a committee that you don't like, you can appeal. And you can say, I don't like this committee. And so long as you can basically find somebody to switch with you, that's allowed. No problem. They want everyone to kind of be where they want to be. They're much more collegial. It's a fancy word they use for the Senate. That means that everyone in the Senate kind of works together a bit more nicely, except for our illustrious senator from Houston. But anyway. So there's that. But one of the things that they can do in the Senate that is not possible in the House, because of the House Rules Committee, is something called filibuster. And I guess the easiest way to describe a filibuster is to say that that's when somebody talks a bill to death. So let's say that, I don't know, I'll be Ted Cruz. That'll be fun. So let's say that the Senate wants to pass a funding bill, you know, keep the government running and all that jazz. But I don't want it because it funds Obamacare provisions too. And I have told my constituents that I'm not in favor of Obamacare. I refuse to vote for funding for Obamacare. So what I might do, hypothetically speaking, would be to get in the recognition of the floor. That means that now it's my turn to talk. And I could just keep talking. Maybe not forever, but probably I would die at some point. But I could just keep talking. Now, in theory, a filibuster will work best at the very end of a session. Because although it sounds funny, and I think I would be really good at a filibuster. Do you think I could talk for a long time? I think I could. Anyway, although you can talk for a long time, probably you can't talk for like 4 months. You know? Probably you're going to have to go to the bathroom at some point. So, what you can do is if it's really close to the end of the session, maybe it's a day or two before the session adjourns. And of course, once the session adjourns, if you haven't voted on the bill, does it pass? No, in fact, it just starts all the way over the next session. So if there's only a day or two left on the congressional session, I could maybe hold the floor that long, you know? And if I do, then I can prevent the bill from coming up to a vote. So Ted Cruz was the most recent sort of famous one. He read Green Eggs and Ham as a bedtime story to his daughters. He said they were listening on C-SPAN. It was bedtime. So he read them a bedtime story. In the 50s, Strom Thurmond was famous for filibustering the Civil Rights Bill. He read from the phone book. At one point, during a filibuster, the entirety of the Odyssey was read aloud before the floor of Congress, which is, well, because in the Senate, once you have been recognized, you have the floor, and nobody can take it from you unless they call for a cloture vote. So cloture is the only way to stop a filibuster, but it requires 60 votes, not just 51, right? To pass a normal bill, you need just 51 votes. So if there are 51 congressmen or senators ready to pass a bill, but I don't want it to pass, I think it's the end of the world, then I, all by my lonesome, can stop the other. Actually, I could stop up to 59 of them. I could stop 59 senators from doing something if I can hold my filibuster for long enough. Now, but if 60 senators vote for what they call a cloture vote, then immediately whatever the bill is will come up for a vote, up or down, yes or no. And then, of course, the filibuster is over. But if they don't have 60 votes, they can't take the floor away from me. Now, I can yield to questions without giving up my time. So sometimes they work in groups, right? So let's say I need to go to the bathroom really bad, So I'm giving my speech or whatever, and then I don't know, maybe Eva's my friend, and so I say, okay, Eva, I send you a text message while I'm talking, which is talent, I think. And so then Eva will say, I'd like to be recognized for a question, and I say, absolutely. And then you read a 5-minute long question, like however long you want. You just keep talking about whatever the question is, and you give your own hypotheticals, and I can like run off the potty and run right back, and that's fine. I can do that. So they can sort of tag team in that respect because I can yield to questions without actually giving up the floor, without ending my speech. So anyway, but you might think that filibusters then don't happen very often because it only really works at the end. And it's true, we don't have a formal filibuster that often. But because the threat of filibuster exists, most laws or bills don't pass the Senate with fewer than 60 votes. Because if I'm the Senate Majority Leader, I don't want to propose a bill that then prompts the other party, let's say I'm a Republican Majority Leader in the Senate. I don't want to propose a bill that's going to get the other party to have a filibuster that's all in the news and we look bad, they look bad, whatever it is. I don't want all that drama in my life. So what I do is I wait and I gather my votes, I get my helpers to make sure we have, and once we have 60 votes, then we propose it. Because no one's going to do a filibuster if they know there's 60 votes on the other side. Does that make sense? So there's this idea that there's a so-called 60-vote Senate these days, that the Senate runs even more slowly because without 60 votes, nothing even gets nothing gets done. Now there is some talk of the filibuster being removed. It's just a rule, or a lack of rule, I guess, in the Senate. So at any point, a bare majority, 51 senators, could choose to vote to get rid of the filibuster, to limit times for debates. They could do that, but they don't usually because someday they will be, no, it can't be filibustered because rule changes can occur with just 51 votes. But they don't because someday they might want to use it themselves, right? The Republicans are currently in charge of the Senate, but just 4 years ago, the Democrats were in charge of the Senate, and the Republicans used the filibuster to their advantage, right? So the parties tend to be pretty reluctant to get rid of the filibuster because it's sort of like their only hope. If whenever they're in the minority, it's sort of like their last chance to be able to stop policies. Well, the nuclear option is getting rid of the filibuster. So if you hear on television, they talk about this idea of a nuclear option. So let me stop the recording.